Nature-based interventions, or NBIs, programs designed to improve health through exposure to natural environments, have exploded in popularity. But within this space, the Japanese practice of Shinrin-Yoku, or forest bathing, struggles with a perception problem. It is often treated as a wellness trend, an Instagram aesthetic, rather than a measurable clinical intervention with serious medical potential. To actually prescribe forest bathing, doctors need hard data, but proving clinical efficacy requires sifting through a highly multidisciplinary field that currently lacks a standardized way to even name its own treatments. A single search for these interventions pulls in studies labeled as ecotherapy, green exercise, blue space interventions, and wilderness therapy. The literature is a tangled knot of overlapping definitions. This naming problem is compounded by severe methodological flaws. A wide swath of these studies rely on very small sample sizes, lack shared research objectives, and feature highly heterogeneous study designs that make direct comparisons nearly impossible. To isolate the actual biological reality of the forest from a simple placebo effect, researchers have to take these thousands of varied, noisy studies and force them through an aggressive, systematic filtration process. This diagram shows the Forest Therapy Conceptual Model, or FTCM. The FTCM is a framework used by researchers to organize the variables of human-nature interaction into a testable baseline matrix. The model begins on the left by defining the human node. Researchers must isolate exact socio-demographics, target groups, and the individual needs of the participants before a study even begins. On the right is the forest node. This categorizes the environment itself, forcing studies to explicitly state the landscape qualities, environmental features, and exact forest types being tested. Connecting them is the central interactions node. This structural bridge tracks how the exposure happens, recording parameters like whether the activity was solo or in a group, guided or unguided, and the exact duration of the session. Finally, the data flows down into the outcomes node. This is where vague concepts of general well-being are separated into highly specific, measurable physiological and psychological data points. Measurable health benefits are not a magical byproduct of simply walking into the woods. They are the direct result of specific, testable variables mapped securely within this exact framework. To find the studies that actually fit this model, researchers use PRISMA. PRISMA stands for Preferred Reporting Items for Systematic Reviews and Meta-Analyses. It is a strict, evidence-based protocol used to filter out poorly designed research and identify valid clinical signals. This PRISMA flowchart visualizes the screening process. From an initial 2,600 database records, researchers apply aggressive exclusion criteria. They eliminate 62 studies lacking strict controls and target confounding variables like medical comorbidities or athletic components. Ultimately, only 13 rigorous studies survive. This filtering also applies to the intervention type. On this secondary PRISMA flowchart, 12 studies were removed for being not Shinrin-Yoku. This ensures the final dataset assesses actual forest bathing, preventing contamination from simulated interventions like virtual reality. The PRISMA framework operates as a ruthless biological sieve. It ensures that only data drawn from identical, strictly controlled parameters survives to reach the synthesis phase. Meeting these inclusion criteria, however, does not guarantee data integrity. The studies that survive the PRISMA sieve must next face an audit of their internal methodology. Reviewers utilize CASP tools to score the remaining randomized controlled trials. The evaluation enforces a strict minimum quality threshold. Any study scoring below 40% on methodological rigor is eliminated, ensuring weak data doesn't poison the final meta-analysis. For animal intervention models, scientists apply the 20-category ARRIVE guidelines. Applying this matrix exposes systemic failures. Almost every study failed to provide proper sample size calculations in Category 10 and exhibited poor allocation to experimental groups in Category 11. Without deploying these aggressive bias assessment tools, researchers run the serious risk of validating therapeutic claims that are actually just artifacts of poor experimental design. Even among the rigorously vetted literature, a persistent structural weakness remains. The vast majority of these validated primary studies rely on highly restricted sample sizes, often testing 50 participants or fewer. This exposes a foundational problem of performance bias in environmental therapy. In a traditional pharmaceutical trial, Neither the patient nor the doctor knows who received the active drug, but it is physically impossible to double-blind a participant to full sensory forest immersion. Because the subjects are entirely aware they are receiving nature therapy, their explicit expectation of a relaxing experience intrinsically inflates their self-reported psychological response scores. This problem is exacerbated by publication bias. Academic journals are statistically far more likely to publish ecotherapy studies that yield positive, encouraging results, while quietly ignoring the studies that return null findings. Evaluating nature-based interventions requires researchers to mathematically adjust for the inherent biases of environmental fieldwork. They cannot treat a forest like a sterile laboratory. Before extracting the final health outcomes, the surviving data pool must undergo one final categorization to account for a massive confounding variable: physical exertion. Researchers take the 13 surviving nature-based interventions and sort them into strict active versus passive methodologies. Active interventions include programs like green exercise and horticultural therapy. In these studies, the elevated heart rate and physical labor obscure the specific effects of the nature exposure itself. We cannot tell if the participant feels better because of the trees or because of the cardio. Passive interventions, however, include activities like nature viewing and static forest bathing. These programs require minimal physical or cognitive effort, effectively holding the subject's activity level at zero. By isolating these passive interventions, researchers successfully remove the exercise variable. This allows them to finally measure the isolated impact of the forest environment directly on human biology. When we look at this strictly filtered, bias-adjusted, passive intervention data, a distinct physiological pattern emerges. This chart maps the extracted endocrine markers from the surviving trials. It reveals statistically significant reductions in both salivary and serum cortisol during forest exposure, compared to the flat trajectory of urban control groups over the exact same timeframes. This biological change is matched by validated psychological markers. Participants show measurable increases on the subjective vitality scale and positive subscales of the PALMS, a psychological rating scale used to assess transient, distinct mood profiles. Looking again at the forest therapy conceptual model diagram, the systematic review process has successfully replaced abstract theory with extracted, validated data. The outcomes node is now populated by verified physiological reductions in stress hormones and quantified improvements in mood states. If ecotherapy is ever going to be fully integrated into evidence-based healthcare, the field must completely abandon vague wellness rhetoric. It requires standardized nomenclature, precise variables, and rigorous reporting guidelines. Ultimately, Shinrin-Yoku is a biologically measurable reality, but its clinical legitimacy exists only so long as it can survive the brutal architecture of the systematic review.